Hey there, welcome back to Pepper Geek. In today's video, I'll be talking about growing pepper plants indoors. So this video is not going to be a guide to growing peppers indoors, but instead I want to talk about all of the different growing methods that you can use to grow your pepper plants inside. So in this video, I'll touch on the basics of growing indoors, what the benefits and the drawbacks are, and then I'll talk about some of the methods that there are available to you to grow your peppers indoors and touch on the pros and cons of each. Finally, I'll share some tips for growing indoors because it definitely is a lot different than growing peppers outdoors. So if you do want to give it a shot, those tips should help you be a little more successful. If you do want a full guide to growing peppers indoors, we have an article over on peppergeek.com. I'll leave a link to that down below. It's very thorough, goes from start to finish, growing from seed through to harvest, all inside. And if you want our best growing guide for growing peppers indoors or outdoors, check out our ebook, Growing Perfect Peppers. It's all about our entire process of growing peppers from seed to harvest, and we include all of our best tips and tricks to growing really healthy pepper plants. So if you're interested in that, I'll leave a link down below as well. Okay, so let's talk growing peppers indoors. Like I said, it's a lot different from growing outdoors, mainly because you have to monitor and control all of the environmental factors. You can see behind me our grow tent where we have some grow lights set up and some pepper plants, along with some other plants that we're growing. Now you can be as casual or as serious as you want about this. It just depends how much time you want to put into it. You don't need to use a grow tent, but if you do, it gives you more control over the environment. So let's talk benefits and drawbacks of growing indoors. The main benefit is that you can grow year-round. It doesn't matter what the temperature is outside, what time of year it is. Even if you're growing in the morning or nighttime, it just doesn't matter. You can control everything, and therefore you can grow your plants any time of the year. Here I have a Jay's Peach Ghost Scorpion Pepper growing on this small plant right now, and it is late December. That's just not possible outdoors in our climate. So it keeps our gardening hobby alive during these winter months and allows us to get harvests when it would otherwise be impossible. And one other benefit that can actually be a drawback if you're not careful is that you can effectively avoid pests and disease while you're growing indoors. In large-scale grow operations, in greenhouses and commercial grows, they are very careful about who is allowed in, what you're wearing. You have to wash your hands, you're wearing a hairnet. It's a very hygienic and cleanly environment, and you can sort of mimic that in your own indoor grow, again, if you're careful. So what are the drawbacks of growing indoors? Well, you're gonna need some equipment like you see behind me. You need grow lights, you'll need a grow tent potentially. You'll need some containers to grow in and soil. I'm just gonna put this down. And you might end up getting some additional tools and gadgets to help you grow more effectively inside. So all of that means that it costs money to grow indoors, but also it's going to use up energy, which definitely is a drawback. It'll cost you more on your electric bill, and you could make the moral argument that why not just wait for the sun to be shining in the springtime and grow then? I mentioned you have to monitor and control more factors such as humidity and temperature, even the nutrient content if you're growing in hydroponics, which we'll talk about later. And getting those things dialed in just right can be pretty challenging. You also don't have the help of pollinators like bees and other flower-seeking insects that help pollinate your pepper plants. So all of this just leads to more work for growing your peppers, where outdoors it's much easier. So if none of that deters you and you still want to grow your peppers indoors, let's talk about some of the methods that you can use to do it. First is just growing in soil. The benefit of this is that it's most similar to just growing outdoors. You likely have everything you need to get started growing with pots and soil and your seeds. Another benefit is you can use pretty much any type of nutrients. You can use organic, slow release fertilizer. You can use liquid nutrients, water soluble nutrients, pretty much any type of fertilizer. You can go ahead and use that in your soil, or you can just rely on the nutrients that are already in your soil to feed the plants. Drawbacks of using soil inside is that it can get pretty messy, especially when you're watering and soil splashes out. It tends to make a mess. You'll also end up using more water to feed these plants than you would in some of the other methods we'll talk about. On top of that, pests can be a major issue, especially where you don't have beneficial insects feeding on those pests. Fungus gnats are very common indoors, but so are thrips, aphids, whiteflies. A lot of these things will lay their eggs in the soil that you buy at the store, and a few weeks after planting, you may start seeing those pests emerging, eating your plants, and then you have to do something about it. With all of those positives and negatives in mind, I actually really like growing in soil indoors. It just keeps things consistent from indoor to outdoor growing. I can continue to learn about growing in containers and test out new methods of growing that we can later apply to our outdoor plants. Next up is hydroponics, and this is one of our Kratky hydroponic systems growing in a large ball jar here, and this is a bell pepper growing in it. And hydroponics is basically growing plants in water, so there's no soil. This is just a ball jar filled with water, which has some nutrients added in, and the plant roots grow directly down into the water. Now there are many different types of hydroponic systems. This is one of the simplest available, called Kratky, but you can get very complex with your hydroponic systems. So the benefits of hydroponics are that there is no soil, so that makes it very clean. There's really no mess, and it can be very easy to set up. This took a matter of 10 minutes or so to set up, but you do have to buy the equipment that's necessary to make it happen. There's also a reduced risk of pests in hydroponics because, again, you're not introducing soil into your indoor growing space. And there are some arguments that hydroponic plants actually grow faster than soil-based plants. We haven't tested this ourselves yet, and in fact, this doesn't seem to be growing any faster than our soil-based companion, which was planted at the same time, but in some cases, I'm sure that that's true. So all of that sounds great. What are the drawbacks of using hydroponics? First off, there's much more monitoring involved. You'd think it's just as easy as adding nutrients and waiting. No, that's not true. You need to monitor for things like pH of the water, the nutrient strength over time changes in the water, and you need to monitor that. The electrical conductivity, also known as EC, measures the salt levels in the water, which if they get out of control can inhibit the plant's growth. So there are a lot of things that you may not think about on day one, but start to cause issues a few months down the line. Another issue is algae. You may be wondering why I have tin foil on the outside of this ball jar. That's to block light from entering this vessel down here where there's nutrient solution. If this were just bare glass, the light would be able to enter and algae would absolutely start forming. We've had this happen many times before. You have to be very diligent and careful not to allow light to enter into your hydroponic vessels. Another issue is root rot. You might see your plants starting to have slimy, dark coloration on their roots. No good. It can affect the plant's growth and eventually cause the plant to die if you don't do something about it. And lastly, you can only use liquid nutrients. There's really no alternative here. You can't use a slow release granular fertilizer or an organic fertilizer really. You have to use man-made, synthetic, non-organic liquid nutrients to feed your hydroponic plants. Now, one potential workaround there is something called aquaponics, where you are putting your fish to work and essentially combining a fish tank with a hydroponic growing system. So your plant roots are submerged in essentially a fish tank. You feed the fish, those fish eat and produce waste. The waste is broken down by beneficial bacteria, and the resulting basic nutrients are feeding your plants. There are many benefits to aquaponics that I won't get into here, but essentially you can take away a lot of the negatives with growing in hydroponics, but there is a lot more initial setup cost and complexity. Another growing method is something that sort of combines soil with hydroponics, and it's something called sub-irrigation or self-watering containers. And I'll use this to demonstrate because we don't actually have this setup going at the moment. But essentially you'd have a plant in a container planted in soil, and then you'd have a larger container beneath it, like so, filled with water, where the roots are allowed to grow down into the water to drink. So a really common way of doing this is using 2 5-gallon buckets. So the top bucket would have a bunch of holes drilled in the bottom, and then the bottom bucket would have a reservoir filled with water. This is a really great way to have stress-free watering, allowing you to take a vacation without worrying about your plants drying out. If you're interested in making one yourself, I'll leave a video down below from another pepper YouTuber who explains it in detail. And finally, I want to talk about plug-and-play hydroponic systems like the one you see behind me, the Click and Grow, or the Aero Garden, or any of the other similar systems that you can buy and set up at home. Now, all of these are hydroponic systems, some type of hydroponics where there is no soil, it's just water and nutrients. And the benefit is you don't really have to think about all of that monitoring that I talked about, and they're just much more aesthetically pleasing. The Click and Grow is a beautiful unit, and it's made to be in your kitchen where you can have peppers and whatever you might want to grow at arm's reach. The drawbacks are that these systems are pretty expensive in most cases. They're also not really made to grow peppers, so unless you're growing a smaller variety like a small red chili or something small like that, you're not going to have a huge yield of something like bell peppers or even jalapenos growing in one of these systems. So now let me give you some of our top tips for growing peppers indoors, regardless of what method you decide to use. The first is to definitely monitor your temperature and humidity and adjust as needed. Peppers like it somewhere around 70 degrees during the day, maybe a little higher than that, and a little bit lower at night, maybe 68 to 70. So for temperature, I highly recommend just growing in a location where it's already the desired temperature. Typical room temperature is great for pepper plants, so if you have a spot where you can grow in your living area, maybe you have a den or an office, somewhere where there isn't too much foot traffic, where you can stick your growing system, that would be ideal. If you have to grow in a cooler place like a basement where I am now, or maybe your garage, then one trick I recommend is having your grow lights go on at night and shut off during the day. It tends to be colder at night, so the plants don't really care when it's daytime. So by running your lights at night, you're adding the heat when it's needed most. If your temperatures are still coming up short, you can try using a seed heating mat beneath your plants to add a little bit of extra heat. Humidity can be a little bit more tricky. Typically in the winter time, it tends to be very dry, so you want to add humidity. Pepper plants like it pretty humid, between 50 and 80% humidity, depending on the variety that you're growing. One simple trick is to hang a damp cloth or towel in your grow tent and allow that to evaporate off water. That will increase the humidity slightly over time. Another more hands-on approach is to spritz your plants in the evening or in the early morning. Spray some water on the back of your grow tent walls. That will again evaporate and increase the humidity inside of the tent. Unfortunately, these methods don't really work if you're growing out in the open. That's one of the benefits of having a grow tent. Now, if you want to go all out, there are humidistats which will monitor the humidity inside your grow space and turn on or off your humidifier as needed. Apart from temperature and humidity, another tip is to shake your plants periodically to encourage self-pollination. Like I said, you don't have bees flying around, hopefully, inside your growing space. And so by shaking your plants a little bit when they're flowering to encourage that pollen to fall off of the flowers and self-pollinate, you'll have much better fruit sets. In addition, I recommend using a small fan to circulate air inside of your growing space. This will also shake the plants and the flowers to encourage self-pollination. And lastly, always monitor for pests and insects with sticky traps. Yellow sticky traps will catch a lot, but if you're looking for things like thrips, you might want to use blue sticky traps. Different colors tend to attract different pests more effectively. So does growing peppers indoors sound like it's something for you? If you plan on trying it out yourself, or if you're an expert, please share your experience and recommendations down in the comments below. Don't forget to check out our ebook, Growing Perfect Peppers, for all of our tips and tricks for growing bountiful pepper plants down in the description. Thanks for watching Pepper Geek, and I'll see you next time.